The Institute.
Institute for Justice.
The National Law Firm for Liberty.
Hello and welcome to Short Circuit, your usually bi-weekly podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeal. I'm your host, John Ross, joined this week by Robert Everett Johnson and IJ Senior Attorney Bob McNamara. This week on the show, an unseemly cash forfeiture, misleading pregnancy-related speech, and an unseemly vehicle impounding rule. Rob, kick us off.
All right, so our first case today is out of the Ninth Circuit, and actually all of our cases today are out of the Ninth Circuit. Just goes to show the Ninth Circuit, the largest circuit in the country, is so large that you can do an entire podcast just focused on that circuit alone.
A whole podcast?
A whole podcast. It's incredible. So this case, opinion by Judge Reinhardt, liberal lion of the Ninth Circuit, it finds that the government violated the Fourth Amendment when it pulled over a motorhome that was traveling down the highway, then held the motorhome for 30 minutes while conducting all kinds of record searches, talking to the guy who's driving. Basically what happens is that the traffic officer who pulled the vehicle over decides, you know what, I don't actually have any reason to keep this guy here. I've kept him for 30 minutes, which is, quite a long time. I have no real reason to keep him, so I have to let him go. But he has this kind of lingering suspicion. So he calls up his buddy in another town down the road and he says, hey, you know what, there's this motorhome headed your way. I think you should pull him over. And when you pull him over, you should have a drug dog there to do a sniff of the motorhome. So the buddy down the road says, okay, fine, I'll do that. So the first traffic stop was for a bogus offense, which is described as a left lane violation, which apparently happens when you are in the left lane driving what the police officer decides is too slow. The second traffic stop is for the wheel of the car drifting over the fog line. So then the car gets stopped again, and this time there's a police officer there with a dog. They end up searching the motorhome, and they find a large amount of cash. It's not the sort of typical sympathetic forfeiture story that we normally do, in the sense that this is a guy in a motorhome with $167,000 in currency that he has no real good story for where it came from. But the notable thing here is the police tactics, which are, they're stretching the limits of what the Constitution would allow, and they're doing it in a way that, if you were to stop this guy and you were to have the stop go on forever, the way if you were to basically combine these two stops into one, it would clearly be unconstitutional. You're holding this guy for a really long time so that you can conduct a drug search with no probable cause. And what the court basically says is you can't take one illegal stop and split it into two stops and then have that be okay. You can't sort of have these two coordinated traffic stops to accomplish something that you couldn't do legally in one stop.
Which makes a certain amount of sense. I mean, if you're going to have a rule that says the police can't extend a traffic stop for the purpose of waiting for a drug dog, then as in other Ninth Circuit opinions, judges have recognized it's impossible to drive without committing some kind of traffic violation, even if I don't think a left lane violation is actually a thing. If one stop can't do it, then surely it can't be the case that we can just serially pull you over and run exactly the same information reports that we've already run for the purpose of delaying you another 15 minutes while the dog gets there. Though just as a side note, totally unrelated to the whole thing, I thought it was fascinating. I love when this comes up and just is unremarked upon, but the theory of the drug dog is going to alert to the scent of drugs on the money. And all the money in the motorhome was vacuum sealed, sort of raising the unanswered question of to what is the drug dog alerting?
That's question that will go unanswered. Very good question. And in some ways what seems to be going on in this case is what the real sort of thing that I find galling here, at least, is the fact that this car is being pulled over based on totally bogus traffic infractions in order to conduct what is essentially a fishing expedition looking for drugs or cash. People shouldn't be basically harassed on the highway. This guy turned out he did have cash, but, a lot of people are just pulled over for no reason and subjected to these kinds of searches based on a pretext. It's not like this guy was speeding. It's not like he conducted a real, even something as real as speeding. He was just committed a quote-unquote left lane violation.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, honestly, that's driving a lot of what you see in appellate Fourth Amendment jurisprudence these days, is that there is no constitutional problem with the police pulling people over for totally bogus reasons because everything is a traffic violation. And I think that intuition is motivating a lot of the more searching inquiry you're starting to see into the length of stops and things like that, because there's no front-end rule about who you can and can't pull over. You can pull over anyone for any reason. And I think it's pretty clear here that this was a fishing expedition. At one point, apparently, on the dash cam recording, the first officer just mutters under his breath, "He's totally carrying cash." Like there was no suspicion of drugs or weapons. This was a fishing expedition for cash. And since you can always find a traffic violation, they could always pull this guy over until eventually a dog shows up, or I guess he breaks and consents to a search.
Yeah, so you get this kind of weird thing where the real sort of issue here is something that the Supreme Court has said is totally fine, which is that the police are, on some level, being dishonest about why they're pulling people over, what they're really trying to do. They're using excuses and pretexts in order to accomplish their ends. But the Supreme Court,
which is totally cool.
The Supreme Court has said, you know what, totally fine for the police to be, I think dishonest is an okay word to use here. The Supreme Court has said that's all right. And so you get this weird result where the actual issue, what I feel like is the issue in this case, goes almost unaddressed. And the panel instead has to sort of focus on, well, the stop was 30 minutes instead of 15 minutes. And not to say that the decision is wrong, it's just there's something almost unsatisfying because the Supreme Court has so badly messed up the issue of pretextual traffic stops.
But I think the key is less that the stop was 30 minutes or 15 minutes. It's more a serious inquiry into what the officer was doing in that time. That it's totally reasonable for the officer to call and get check the license and run the plates of the vehicle he has. It's everything he does after he's completed that. And the key is in the second stop, there's more delay for calling and running the plates, even though the first guy ran the plates and they're the same plates and he gets the same reports. They're not doing anything unrelated to the fishing mission.
Another interesting wrinkle in this case, and I don't think it comes up in the Ninth Circuit decision, but it is in the district court decision, is that the prosecutors never mentioned there was a first stop in their initial forfeiture filings. And it's not until this guy gets a lawyer and starts the legal process that, oh, by the way, there was this whole first stop where a guy didn't have the dog and he called ahead to make sure the next guy did. The government's not being entirely candid here, and they do get their wrist slapped at the district court level. It doesn't, for whatever reason, that's not in the Ninth Circuit's opinion, however. And with that, we'll move on to the next case. Bob.
Sure. So our next case also, once again, comes out of the Ninth Circuit because I guess Rob Johnson is having a nostalgia tour from his clerkship. You can take the boy out of the Ninth Circuit, but you can't take the Ninth Circuit out of the boy. Is a case about assertedly misleading speech related to pregnancy-related services. This is a challenge to a municipal regulation of what are sometimes called crisis pregnancy centers. Crisis pregnancy centers are centers that provide pregnancy-related services but don't provide abortions and won't provide referrals to anyone who provides abortions for ideological reasons. And there has been a lot of controversy over whether these centers are misleading people in not disclosing that they don't provide abortions and not disclosing that they don't provide all potential medical services. And so the municipal regulation prohibits any advertisement of these services that is misleading either by commission or by omission. The theory, I think, being that by not saying we do not provide abortions, they're misleading people who view their advertisements. And the really interesting thing, which the Ninth Circuit upholds and upholds basically because it views this as a regulation of misleading commercial speech. Misleading commercial speech isn't protected. And the plaintiff argues that this isn't commercial speech. This isn't commercial speech because they're not a commercial entity. They're a nonprofit. And the really interesting move I think the majority opinion makes is it says, well, this is commercial speech because it's clearly an advertisement for your services. And while your patients don't pay you for your services, they're free, you still have a commercial motive because the more patients you can bring into your center, the more donations you can raise. And therefore, that's a commercial motive, and that makes this commercial speech, which is regulable as advertising, which is, I think, a very difficult move to kind of get your head around. I understand the intuition of the panel and sort of a difficulty with how we talk about commercial speech is I think a lot of people in their gut want to say, well, commercial speech is advertising. And I know what advertising is when I see it. and advertising is subject only to the commercial speech protections. But the Supreme Court's doctrine doesn't just say advertising is commercial speech. It says advertising from an economic motive, or that appeals to the economic motives of the listeners is commercial speech. And the Ninth Circuit's move saying that you're engaged in commercial speech because you're trying to get people to take advantage of your services so that you can then solicit donations to continue providing those services seems like it swallows an awful lot more than the opinion really wants to acknowledge. I mean, it seems like by that logic, Operation Smile, advertising for facial corrective surgeries that it's providing for free, is engaged in commercial speech because what it wants to do is provide those services for free and then use the fact that they've provided those services to raise money in order to provide more services. And I guess you can kind of say that with a nefarious tone in your voice, but ultimately that's what literally every charity does. Charities want to provide services, and in order to continue providing those services, charities have to raise money, and the most effective way to raise money as a charity is to point out that you're an effective charity that does the things that people want your charity to do and that people want their charitable dollars to support. And I'm not sure that's really a tenable rule of law. Setting aside all the controversies and whatever one may think of crisis pregnancy centers, it seems like that idea would swallow a lot of charitable solicitation, even though the Supreme Court has already clearly told us that charitable solicitation is non-commercial speech, that if I'm just asking for you to donate money to my charitable endeavors, I'm engaged in fully protected and indeed political speech. And that's just kind of unaddressed.
It actually seems like the Supreme Court has directly addressed this issue in cases involving lawyer solicitation, where they have said that lawyers soliciting paying clients can be regulated in certain ways, and that the ACLU or nonprofit organizations providing the NAACP or not at the Supreme Court, but the Institute for Justice, organizations that provide their legal services for free for an ideological purpose are not subject to those same kind of restrictions, because there is in fact a difference between providing something in a commercial setting and providing something in a non-commercial setting. And now that may itself be wrong.
But the Supreme Court has said it. It's strange to say that, well, you can't regulate the pure solicitation of that, but you could regulate it if then there's a charitable solicitation the lawyer makes to donors on the other end, particularly when, in cases like Riley v. National Federation for the Blind, the Supreme Court has said that those charitable solicitations themselves are protected non-commercial speech. It seems like there are, in two different directions, there's a major doctrinal problem that really only gets a paragraph in this opinion.
Yeah, and that's not the only weird thing about the decision. It's probably the most prominent weird thing. But then the other weird thing is that even if it is commercial speech, it can only be regulated if it's misleading. And the panel just basically says, well, this must be misleading because the statute or the ordinance...
The statute says it regulates misleading speech.
Right. And so if the statute says it's misleading, then it must be misleading. But of course, the question is whether it's misleading in a constitutional sense, a question that they don't even address. And actually, there's this concurrence, which is part concurrence, part dubitante, which is a fascinating little piece of writing by Judge Toshima, who
I think this is the first dubitante I've seen that didn't come from Judge Easterbrook.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's a great word.
So what's in dubitante?
Dubitante basically just means I think you might be wrong, but I'm not sure, and I'm just going to write something. But my vote, it's if you have your vote doesn't really matter to the outcome, so you can.
I'm concurring, but I'm dubious of the grounds on which I'm concurring, even though I think they're probably the law. Judge Easterbrook would use it when he thinks he's following Supreme Court precedent that has been undermined but is still technically binding. He's concurring dubitante. Though it is the case that you don't see many judges do this, but you can actually just write anything you want after the word concurring.
Yes. Well, you can actually write anything you want at all. I mean, so there are other judges on the Ninth Circuit who have all kinds of curious things that they put in there. But Judge Toshima basically says, look, like, you have this whole discussion in a separate part of the opinion about, this preemption question of whether the San Francisco ordinance is preempted by state law, and there you have a whole different sort of view of the way this works. In the constitutional context, you say, oh well, it's commercial speech, so it's not protected. But then in the preemption context, the panel turns around and says, oh well, it's not preempted by the state unfair competition law because it's not commercial activity, so it's not covered. So the panel is basically doing backflips in each part of the opinion. My favorite part actually has to do with the question of whether this is viewpoint discrimination, which, I don't know, it sort of seems like it clearly is, right? I mean, they're going after people who have one view on the issue of abortion.
No, and it seems like even if you concede that this is misleading commercial speech, you have kind of an RAV problem of why is what showing has the government made that this kind of misleading speech can be regulated more harshly than other misleading commercial speech. And it could be that's a showing they can make or maybe did make. I haven't read the briefs, but this is an interesting opinion. It's a surprisingly long opinion for how little time it seems to spend on the issues that I think are trickiest here, and that really raise thorny doctrinal questions that you would expect the court to have to wrestle with. It goes, I mean, the two opinions together are 40-some pages, and really all of the stuff that you would sort of pause on and that you could write a law school exam about are done in a paragraph.
One interesting footnote on this, the commercial speech doctrine itself actually has its origin in a case about abortion, Bigelow versus Virginia. The Supreme Court had for years sort of said, commercial speech gets no protection at all. And then the government in Virginia went after an abortion provider who wanted to advertise his services. And the court said, well, actually, maybe there is some social value to, this was a pro-abortion Supreme Court. And they said, well, there's social value to commercial speech after all because it can touch on real issues that are not just like buying and selling something on the marketplace, but there's like buying and selling stuff
on things that matter to us.
Right, exactly. And I think they touches on an issue that we talk about sometimes, which is that economic rights actually touch on all kinds of other rights, and that you can't really separate out the economic sphere from the non-economic sphere. So it's interesting to see the Supreme Court sort of beginning to see that in the 1970s in the abortion context, and then here you see the Ninth Circuit for sort of similar political reasons kind of forgetting it conveniently.
I do think goes to just sort of the broader question of how courts treat economic rights, because I think in sort of a pure economic sense, the court is actually right to say that there's some commercial motive on the charity's part because the charity does want to go solicit money. They're doing these things in part so that they can get people to give them money to keep doing these things. That's an underlying economic reality. But I just think that's an underlying economic reality of basically anything anyone does at a certain level of abstraction. Right? Yes, politicians say things because they believe them, but politicians also say things because they want to get votes, and politicians also say things because they want people to donate money to their reelection campaign. So there is a commercial motive of pure political speech in that sense. And the idea that you can somehow surgically remove money from the equation and say, in this box we have rights that matter, and in this box we have rights that are related, however tangentially, to money. That really, I think, the difficulty you have in thinking through what this opinion does with the commercial speech doctrine sort of shows up how wrong-headed that divide can be in the first place, that merely because money is involved, we're going to apply a lower standard of review, leads directly to, it doesn't really take that many steps in any given case to get to a place where money is involved, and we can therefore apply a lower standard of review.
Yeah, I mean, what you start to see with this opinion is just how when you start creating exceptions to the First Amendment, the commercial speech doctrine or other types of doctrine, those exceptions are going to be used by judges for political reasons to silence speech that they don't like.
Okay, let's move on to the final case now. Rob?
Great. So also out of the Ninth Circuit.
Shocking.
We have a very short, refreshingly short opinion from Judge Kaczynski. This is a case involving a woman who lent her car to her brother-in-law, who then was pulled over for driving with a suspended license. And the Los Angeles police department has a policy as pursuant to a local ordinance, or actually, I guess, a state statute, that if you have a vehicle that's being driven on a suspended license that is seized, it then has to be impounded for 30 days, and you can't get it back for 30 days. And the question is, is this a seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment? And the Seventh Circuit, separately, in an earlier case, had addressed a similar statute and had said, the initial seizure of the car is lawful because you have a permissible purpose to take it because the person is driving on a suspended license, and you can't just leave it there. You have to take when you pull them over, you then have to take the car somewhere. So that makes sense. And then what the Seventh Circuit says is once you've lawfully seized it, that's the end of the inquiry under the Fourth Amendment. The fact that you then keep it for a really long time is kind of neither here nor there. And what the Ninth Circuit here says is, no, that we actually disagree with that, which is, a lot of courts hate creating circuit splits. And Judge Kaczynski, I think to his credit, kind of loves creating circuit splits.
He's very explicit. You don't see many 9-page opinions that create a clear circuit split, but he does.
It is a brave move, and it is basically inviting Supreme Court review. It's saying, look, I am going to expressly disagree with another court. Take it up if you think I'm wrong.
Though the interesting thing, I will confess I have not read the Seventh Circuit's opinion with which he's disagreeing, but it seems strange to take the position that the Fourth Amendment only applies at the moment of seizure when just tying back into the first case we talked about. That's not how we treat other seizures. Once a motorist is pulled over, that is the moment of seizure. But keeping him there, every moment you keep him there is continuing the seizure, because the baseline assumption is he gets to go when you're done seizing him. One would think the same holds true of property, where the baseline assumption is that when you're done seizing my property, I get to take it where I please.
You would think so. And actually, Kaczynski cites a Supreme Court case involving a seizure of a suitcase. And it's one of these airport seizure cases where the police were looking for drugs or cash in a suitcase. And in there, the suitcase was held for 90 minutes. And the Supreme Court said that was an unconstitutional detention. Sometimes you sort of compare these old Supreme Court decisions about property rights, from the 70s, not exactly like the halcyon days of property rights, but they're extraordinarily protective in terms of how quickly things have to happen in the seizure context. To compare that to a lot of what goes on in the country today using civil forfeiture statutes and other types of statutes like the one at issue here. And you're talking about like 90 days as a violation according to the Supreme Court versus 30 days, or 90 minutes is a violation according to the Supreme Court versus 30 days under the California statute.
And as compared to a lot of forfeiture laws nationwide, 30 days is actually very quick. It's not at all unusual to see property detained for months or even years. And part of it, I think, just goes to show the importance of litigation. It turns out when you present these issues to courts say, oh, these really long detentions that aren't justified by anything are unconstitutional. And yet you look at the facts on the ground, and in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, you see these lengthy detentions because they aren't being challenged, which is, not to plug our job too much, but it's one of the reasons I like working here, is that it's surprising how much kind of low-hanging fruit there still is that needs to be picked up by public interest attorneys. The doctrine is actually really good on how long the government can keep your stuff, and that turns out not to match up very well with how long the government actually keeps your stuff. And it's an area where you can and where we are making real headway.
Yeah, and this is a very promising little decision that I think will have major ramifications in the Ninth Circuit, but I also think, now we have a circuit split here, and I think other circuits are going to have to weigh in, and it'll be exciting to see, as this issue gets raised in other circuits, how people come down.
So did the plaintiff actually win this case? Is the law unconstitutional, or is there more going on?
So it goes back. The case goes back, and I think there's questions that are going to have to be addressed on remand. One sort of interesting footnote basically says, we're not addressing the question of whether it would be permissible to hold the car for 30 days as a punishment. That's kind of a separate issue. And I think that's going to have to be raised and addressed on remand.
Right. Really, the only thing that had happened in the district court is the district court said that this was a valid administrative penalty under the Fourth Amendment. And Judge Kaczynski points out correctly that no, the question is whether this is a seizure for purposes of the Fourth Amendment, and it is. And then he just drops a footnote saying we're not going to take a position on whether there are Fifth Amendment implications, and sort of invites the plaintiff to amend her complaint on remand and explore that as well. So this could very well come back up to the Ninth Circuit, presenting kind of broader and even more interesting legal issues. But it's a rifle shot opinion that really creates an interesting Fourth Amendment split in a way that at least to me, is very persuasively argued.
Okay, that concludes the show. Thanks for listening. We appreciate you. Until next time, this is John Ross from the Institute for Justice, accoutering you to get engaged.